interesting because I feel like that is a dynamic that follows the Chinese Communist Party where it goes in the world. Like when you're talking about like this group of the political elite of this one party who were pro-China and pro-CCP and wanted to do more deals, but the population itself was not for that. It sounds similar to what's happening in the Solomon Islands now. It sounds similar to what's happening in some of these smaller European countries where there's been a lot of economic money, influence, Belt and Road stuff coming in from China into Eastern Europe, for example. So it's interesting that like in the process of trying to establish their influence, they're actually undermining it.
Right. But it's like every country. I mean, we're talking about South Korea, obviously it's like, it reminds me in many ways of the US in the sense that you have a political elite class, and it's kind of like a financial / political elite that represents their own interests, and they're not necessarily the interests of the population. And it's really, I don't think the US is a kind of, Democrat-Republican split really in the way that it's made out to be on Twitter. It's more like you've got, these billionaires and you have this elite political class that kind of have their interests, and a lot of them are in China. And there's just not a whole lot that the population can do with voting sometimes, because whoever they vote for with either party potentially could be part of that system. And I don't know if that's the same with South Korea.
It's a little different. It's similar. It's similar enough, put it that way. But it is trying to, and what you've described is Chinese trying to get into a country, trying to control it, or get political influence from the top down. You try to get the people at the top hooked. You get them on your payroll. You get them addicted. And it doesn't really seem to matter much from their perspective, what the rest of the population thinks. This is never, say, the Chinese coming and trying to sell their system from the ground up, but rather you find the people at the top, you get them hooked on Chinese money, the prospects of more money, and that seems to be the nature of so much of China's influence. When you look at it, it's really just at the very top, or in this small constituency that has some direct benefit from sort of Chinese largesse. It's rarely ideological anymore. In fact, almost South Korea was probably one rare example where it was, where Moon Jae-in, the former president, and the people right around them, if you listen to what they said, look at their track records of what they've written, what they've spoken about, that these were guys who kind of were pro-China, pro-communist. I mentioned Moon Jae-in. He wrote an autobiography a while back, and he described himself as euphoric when he heard the Americans had lost in Vietnam. I imagine he was something even more than euphoric when we got driven out of Afghanistan. But so in one sense, South Korea is kind of unusual in that you do have some ideologues running the place. Most places, it's the Chinese cash that does the talking. And once again, the Pacific Islands, the Pacific, and I would suggest even in the United States that it's something similar. If China had all the economic wherewithal with Russia, I don't think it would have anywhere near the political support in Washington. But you do have this donor class that, as you said, that it almost operates independent of the body of the citizenry, and they almost seem to do things that don't really have the public in mind, but rather have this personal interest couched as statesmanship that doesn't make a whole lot of sense sometimes. But I think what you have described is a very important way to sort of part of the equation to keep in mind, is that the Chinese do come in from the top, and you're buying off the elite classes, the business classes in certain places. And once you've done that, what happens below that isn't all that big a deal until it is, because it always leads to friction. It leads to internal unrest, and potentially civil war. And the Solomon Islands, as you've mentioned, is a good example of this dynamic at play.
Right. Well, so speaking of the Solomon Islands, so Prime Minister Sogavari is one of those elite class people who has a lot of Chinese interests, and he, was involved in switching diplomatic relations from Taiwan to China, and which they call the switch there in the Solomon Islands, and there were big protests there last November, calling, it was kind of two things as I understand it. One is anti-China investment in the Solomon Islands, and two, wanting Sogavari to step down. But he kind of used a Chinese slush fund that he had gotten to kind of pull himself out of the no confidence vote, and now he's just signed a security deal, or it's been public what he signed with China, which could bring in troops to protect him from his own people protesting.
Yes, that's what you've watched happen is something most people in the Solomon Islands don't want to have happen. And it is the result of this elite capture. That's the SAT word. It means you find the guys with some in the right positions, and you buy them, pay them up, buy them off. And logging companies, with basically Chinese owned, have had huge influence in the Solomons for a long time. And they're not popular because they are rapacious. They just destroy the environment. The locals get no benefits out of these hardly. And the misbehavior of loggers is something that really irritates a lot of people. And that's putting it nicely. But you bought off the top guy. And he is able to dole out cash to, as you mentioned, to enough parliamentarians to maintain his position. Ironically, after the riots last November, that the Sogavari was on the verge of being tossed out in a no-confidence vote. And then the Australians came and saved him. And now Sogavari has signed the deal with the Chinese that effectively allows the Chinese military free reign in Solomon Islands. This is immensely unpopular. Some of the main provinces have been opposed to this sort of thing for a long, long time. And it is very unpopular with the mass of the body of the population. But he's gone ahead with it. And Sogavari is probably going to try to sort of postpone the 2023 elections. And where have we seen this dynamic before? And because he would lose them almost certainly. But one thing that I've spent some time looking into Chinese political warfare, subversion, is the thing that really juices it. It really makes it work is the bribery. It's the under the table activity. You send guys, politicians, children to China, scholarships. You bring them to China, politicians, leaders to China on study tours. And they show up and they get a bag of cash at the airport, or it's an envelope of cash, actually. Everybody knows this. And there's so much bribery going on. And it's known, but it never gets exposed. And that is a piece of the counter strategy that I'd like to see the civilized world help these islands with, and help the people who want to stay sort of independent. Is we should be getting our money's worth out of our $90 billion intelligence budget in the United States, and maybe apply some of that to exposing this stuff to high heaven. So everyone on earth knows when a leader, say the guy like Sogavari, who has been reported to have some very shady dealings, so that everybody in the Solomon Islands knows this, everyone in the Pacific knows this, and give the people who sort of say want honest government, give them some ammunition to work with. But it's by not exposing this, and it's not just Solomon Islands, it's just about everywhere the Chinese operate. Expose those under the table deals. That would be very useful. It's a missing piece of the puzzle that I wish we would pay more attention to.
Yeah. So, expanding out from the Solomon Islands and looking at the U.S. and Taiwan and Japan and Korea, what do you think these countries ought to do now, looking at the Chinese Communist Party's threat particularly vis-a-vis Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Like, what do we in the West collectively need to do now?
Well, we've got to get ready and fast. And Ukraine, if there is one sort of a bright side to all of this, that it has woken people up to the actual and immediate threat and the possibility of this sort of large-scale warfare that a lot of people thought was what those loser previous generations did, but we'd outgrown it. No, not quite. And that's coming. So, say, waking up is something that needs done. I think we sort of have, and then get ready to deal with it. And Taiwan, of course, is a place that gets all the attention, but you will find yourself having to respond. You never quite know where the next outrage is going to take place. But this is going to require the things like we've seen, where you've got a lot of these European countries trying to improve their military capabilities that they have allowed to lapse, because they thought they wouldn't need them. They thought the Americans would take care of them. The Japanese, same thing. They've got to sort of get their military act together. And then you find that the one thing that really sort of causes a lot of trouble to the Russians, the Russias, the Chinas of the world, is they don't like facing alliances, because that makes it very hard for them. They're good at bullying people one-on-one, but an alliance is something that really they hate it. And the Chinese in particular, they say as much. So when you combine the resources of sort of free nations, that you've got really a real impressive countermeasure on a military perspective. But that also leads to a political sort of tightening, which is very useful, once again, for resisting this sort of aggression. And that also leads to an economic tightening that is also what you need. So it's this combination of military, economic, political, and the diplomatic is more a tool rather than anything else. But that's where the effort needs to be applied, and apply it where you think you're really going to need it. And Taiwan, once again, comes immediately to mind. But it's interesting that the free world seems to have sort of woken up. Let's see if it stays woken up. But back to Taiwan, that's really for Asia. I see Taiwan as key to so much because of the geography, and also the political significance of it. That if we can't keep 24 million free people free, despite U.S.'s powerful military, despite its political and economic power, financial resources, its ability to apply pressure on China, and its nuclear weapons. If it can't keep Taiwan free, well, everyone else is going to say, well, who can? So this is a place where some attention does need to be applied.